Well, the old axiom is, JD, you can't do anything unless you get elected here, and I think that's the route that Ben Carson is taking here. And interesting you mentioned the fact that the commonality between Welby and Ben Carson both being pediatric neurosurgeons, and she might be able to, in a state like Oregon, take that stance, but that's not necessarily reflected by quote-unquote establishment candidates in other states. If you compare Welby to, say, Jack Kingston in Georgia, who's going to face off against David Perdue, someone who might be considered an establishment candidate. He's certainly not pro-choice in Georgia, as far as I know, and is running on his conservative record in that state. So it's interesting how this plays out. And of course, your alternative, if you are a Republican in Oregon, is having Jeff Merkley be reelected back to the Senate. So the question I think Ben Carson is asking is, would you rather have a Democrat like Jeff Merkley or a Republican, even if she is pro-choice and pro-gay marriage, as she said?
Well, it's interesting the way Dr. Carson put it, a little different from what Ronald Reagan said, but no doubt the same principle in mind. Ronald Reagan used to say, not that he paid slavish attention to the polls, but he said, when you find yourself an 80% issue, go up and put your arm around it. The presumption being if it didn't violate core principles. And also, Reagan would use the notion of, if I can get 3/4 of a loaf right now, I won't worry about the other 1/4 of the loaf we don't get. In much the same way, Dr. Carson, in his most recent column, appearing at the Washington Times, says, look, if 90% is what we get, and there are a couple of disagreements, why have the major fights? Yes, we need primaries, and people have different perspectives, but this effort, and I can understand it because stories are easily digestible and reportable if you have one side and the other.
Yeah.
And so now the angle that everyone's played is it's the establishment versus the Tea Party. But John, as you point out, that's a little too simplistic. Every race is different. Every candidate is different. And perhaps the greatest remark I heard when it came to disagreements on the campaign trail and in terms of Congress, the late Jerry Solomon, the congressman from upstate New York, the proud Marine who was chairman of the Rules Committee when I first went to Washington, it was that wise congressman who said, hey, look, my wife loves me, but we don't agree about everything. We are pleased to be joined now by the aforementioned Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson, it is great to have you here on America's Forum. Thanks for making time for us.
It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be with you.
Now, why don't we start with the column that appears at the Washington Times website, where you talk about blending principles with pragmatism. We were just discussing, and you made mention of it in your column, your support for your professional colleague, Dr. Monica Welby, and her race out in Oregon, even though you disagree on a couple of key social issues.
Exactly. And you know, people are always going to disagree. I always say if two people agree about everything, one of them isn't necessary. But you know, what conservatives have to understand is if they take the attitude after the primary, my candidate didn't win, I'm taking my marbles and going home, they're playing right into the plan of the progressive movement. And we have to be smarter than that. And the fact of the matter is, if we take somebody who agrees with us most of the time, so that we can gain power, we have the ability to sort out whatever other small differences exist after that. But if you never get into position to be able to do anything, then what, as Hillary would say, what difference does it make? You know, we're not going to get there. We got to get there first.
Dr. Carson, you were in my hometown of High Point, North Carolina last week, if memory serves. I was way out in San Diego a couple of weeks ago, and people stopped me to say, we got to get Ben Carson to run for president. I believe there have been some public remarks where you said that you're being, quote, pressured to run for president. Are you taking a look at running for public office, specifically the presidency?
Well, it continues to be something that I don't want to do. But I also recognize that our country is in an enormous amount of difficulty. And if there was a lot of Americans, and I mean a lot, who really thought that I should do that, I would have to give it serious consideration. But you know, it's a little bit early at this stage of the game. We have to see what happens in November. Does the country truly have the gravitas and the will to make the kind of changes that need to be made to keep us from becoming a mammoth government structure? And if I can see that the people actually have the will to do that, and if they still want me to do it, then I would certainly give it serious consideration.
Well, Dr. Carson, let me follow up on that before I ask my next question. What could you quantify that for us when you talk about a lot of people saying, Dr. Carson, we want you to run? Is there a petition going right now? And how many signatures would it take? Because I'm sure we could get that started right now.
Well, there's the Run group. I don't have anything to do with them. They're a PAC.
But what specifically do you need to see if you're going to go ahead and make that leap?
Well, I have to continue to see the same kind of fervor that I see now as I travel around the country. You know, if that begins to wane, and if somebody else really is speaking the language that people want to hear and can identify with, somebody who really understands the importance of the American Constitution, who understands the importance of personal freedom, that we cannot give our freedoms away to the government, who understands business, why people go into business, innovation, how to create an atmosphere that would foster that rather than depress it, then, you know, that would be somebody that I could get behind too.
And real quickly, I want to get back to what you were saying there about those social issues and the need for Republicans to move past what you said were small issues so they can focus on the big things. But when I have these conversations with Christian conservatives especially, they say gay marriage and the issue of abortion are not small issues and not things that can be kind of set aside for a different day, a different conversation.
Well, you have to recognize that you have to get to a position where you can do something about those things. You know, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and I believe that abortion is murder. But I also recognize that if I cannot get to a position and have a critical mass of people who can help do it, then it doesn't make any difference. People have got to understand that point.
Dr. Carson, only about a minute left. The same folks who I saw out in San Diego a couple of weeks ago said, here's this new book by Dr. Carson, you have to read it. With about a minute, tell us about your new book.
Well, the book is called One Nation. The reason it's called One Nation is because I'm pointing out the fact that we, the American people, are not each other's enemies. We're natural allies, but we've allowed ourselves to be manipulated by those forces that drive wedges into every possible crack to create a war, gender wars and race wars and income wars and you know, age wars, any kind of war that you possibly can. Keep people at each other's throat, direct them away from the things that are important. Things like the economy, the national debt, our casting away of our moral values and the things that allow us to have an identity. You know, we even want to get rid of phrases like under God. And, you know, some of the things that are patriotic are seen as perhaps bad now. And
so we have to make those changes.
I want to understand
Dr. Carson, I hate to interrupt, we're going to have to leave it there, but we look forward to a return engagement with you here on America's Forum, and we will read with interest your new book, One Nation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Dr. Ben Carson, what do you think about him running for president? Why don't you let us know?